Well, I got to say I'm impressed because that was a heck of a party last night. And it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. Although, you know, when you have a session first thing in the morning, you make a point of not staying to the end. How many did stay to the end? Wow. Maybe I'm just bearing witness to the superior Kiwi stamina here. I actually was born in New Zealand. I was born in Tauranga, and my family moved to Canada when I was 3. So that's why I sound like an American. Unfortunately, I travel enough that the Canadians now complain that I sound like an American, and the Americans say, "You're not from around here, are you?" But I definitely don't sound like I'm from down here. But I did manage to, on the weekend, rent a Holden Commodore and drive on the wrong side of the road and get down to Tauranga to visit my uncle, who still has a dairy farm on Ohuiti Road. He's 70-something now, and so my viewpoint on New Zealand is a little skewed by an elderly dairy farmer. Apparently, avocado is pig food, and when I come to my senses, I can build myself a house on a piece of the dairy farm. So one of these days, I'll get around to that. But so far, still living in Canada and traveling everywhere else on somebody else's dime, which I highly recommend. If you get somebody to pay for you to travel around, it's a good choice. My name is Richard Campbell. For those who haven't run across me before, I've been a geek for a really long time. In 1977, I wandered into a Radio Shack at the tender age of 10 and encountered a TRS-80 Model 1. It had 4K of RAM, a cassette tape player, and 3 error messages: what, how, and sorry. Which, to this day, when I look at like an ASP.NET error message with the orange bands and all that stuff, I think, sorry. They're not particularly informative. But I spend most of my time these days balancing between a few different companies. I've done a lot of work on making apps go faster. For whatever reason, I've got a mind that straddles the line between the hardware and the software quite well. And fitting into that niche pays well. You only want to work so many hours, so you might as well work on the hours that pay you the best. And I've built enough hardware and done enough network design that over the years I've spent a lot of time balancing between how do we make this run fast and how do we write it the way that's going to be maintainable back and forth between them. And that's really, if you get into the business of scaling sites, you'll find out you need to be fluent on both sides of the equation. Makes you a little bipolar, but that's the trade-off. Now, a few years ago, a group of friends of mine that all did the same sort of work. We all scaled systems. And I try to say just scaling systems, not just scaling websites, because I scaled DCOM back in the day. And if you've ever done that, the D stands for dumb. And we came to this realization that there was a certain number of techniques, there's sort of patterns to how you scale systems. Certain things you look for and approaches and testing methodologies and so forth. And strange loop networks clearly came out of that set of thinking, that we could take those techniques and we could put them into an appliance. And then that appliance would simply sit in front of the website and analyze the traffic as it moved back and forth and find ways to make it go faster. So we started that as a research project in 2004. We proved it would work by about 2006, filed a patent, raised a bunch of money. We've been building it ever since. Building a network appliance is way harder than it looks, but it's been a lot of fun. And a lot of the research that goes into this session and many others that I do on scaling comes from the work we've done at Strangely, because in the end, our job is to take websites absolutely to the limit and then find a ways to make them go further on the same hardware, one way or the other. So we have a lab back in Vancouver with a sign that says, "We kill web servers for fun and profit." And so I've got a pile of data on what IIS looks like just before it tips over. And different versions fail in different ways, and there's lots of interesting tidbits about what that looks like. And I've done this out in the field a fair bit. So I'm going to bring a bunch of these stories to you, and we can talk through what your apps look like in this continuum of evolution. Now, besides Strange Loop, I do a couple of talk shows. So one of them is .NET Rocks. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Fantastic. It's a few hands. We did the 64-bit question on Monday, which was good fun. The .NET Rocks is an internet audio talk show. We call it that because we started in 2002, which is about 2 years before the word podcast was invented. And we publish 2 shows a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. We're coming up on show 600, so do yourself a favor and don't try and go back and listen to all of them. It's a lot of shows. But we generally grab some luminary from the .NET community and we talk to them for about an hour about what's important to them or what technologies we like. And it's convenient that Microsoft just keeps making more so we can have new stuff to talk about and dig into steadily. On the other side of the equation, Run As Radio is me exercising my IT mind. It's a weekly show aimed at the infrastructure and IT pros that maintain these systems that us developers build. And we do that once a week. Also good fun. A little shorter, more serious. .NET Rocks is very lighthearted. Run As Radio, we're in more of a hurry. Just I think it's the nature of the community as well. Different people listen at different times. We've realized that with .NET Rocks, most people are listening on their commute. So we designed the show to make it easy to listen on the commute. Just to sort of an overview with interesting colors. Everybody's application, their web app, falls somewhere on this spectrum. From the very earliest, just kind of make it work versions, and as the page views start to go up, it gets more and more complex. And this session is really architected around, I want to set some fundamental ideas about how we calculate and understand scaling, and then I want to work through this continuum of the most basic apps to the most advanced and what elements there are in them that make them successful. And I'm presuming that somewhere in the spectrum your app will live. And so when we hit your app, then we can talk about what the next version of your app would look like. All right? So that's the spectrum of this discussion. Now, one of the problems that people run into right away is, what do I need to measure to understand how my app is performing? Like, what is good? What is bad? What will the next version be able to do? And there's lots of numbers of varying value depending on who you are. Okay? So it's easy to start with numbers like this kind of capacity. How many users have we got? Good number. Not actually useful for anything, but it makes people happy. Right? And so when we're talking to our business people, we talk about, we've got 100,000 customers in the system. None of them come to the website, but yeah, we've got a lot of customers. That gets more relevant when we start talking about active sessions. Now we're talking about how many users have been in the system in a given period of time and how frequently they're hitting and how we've played with the session object. Concurrent users is very hard to measure, but it's remarkably relevant because often the first sign of problems of scaling is as the number of concurrent users rises above 1. You can support a lot of users with concurrency of 1. Right? If your queries are pretty fast, you can have several hundred people on the site at once, and they're mostly viewing pages. It's only when they actually make a request that something goes to the back end and comes back out again. And the first time you start seeing pain is when several people are doing it at the same time and you actually have real concurrency. And if you think about it, the way that most developers performance tune, it's about driving that concurrency number down. If I make my query faster, more people can use the site. And it's because concurrency stays close to 1. Right? It's a very different way to think about how I can have higher levels of concurrency that run consistently. Okay, that's a different problem. And it's actually, you're going to hit a threshold where you must figure that out. Sustained concurrency. Now those are just straight capacity numbers, and they're not hugely powerful in terms of thinking about how we're going to scale sites long term. Throughput is a number that the IT guys like, because that directly measures how much hardware I need. So throughput talks about how many users can I have on a machine at a time and still be successful. And typically you'll see this measured in page views per month, which is not a great number. But I can usually derive a lot of useful stuff from page views per month. Now, that gets deeper into this requests and transactions per second. And I list both because people often use them interchangeably. But I think of requests as human-initiated and transactions as technology-initiated. So a human-initiated request is a request for a page. Transactions per second actually says, what's all the stuff that was needed for that page? There'll be more transactions, okay? And we can argue whether that's the actual measurement. But when I think about the first real number in all of this that I've talked about that really tells me how stressed your system is, it is that transactions per second number at peak, wherever that peak may be. Okay, and different sites have different peaks. Maybe you've got a daytime site only running in your office, and typically in the afternoon is when it gets its peak. E-commerce sites that are localized to their country might have a peak in the evening. And if you have a multinational site, you quickly find out there's a North American peak, and there's a European peak, and there's an Asian peak. Right? And it's 3 different waves. Those are the first numbers where we start to say, okay, how good is my system? Well, it can sustain 1,000 transactions per second over an hour. By the way, that number is unbelievably good. There are very few sites that run that high, really. Okay? And as we go along here, I'll happily share with you my experience of what real numbers look like. I've seen tons of sites that were very successful at 20 transactions per second. They're making money. They're content. That's good. Okay, so 1,000 is an unbelievable number. Now, on the development side of things, we get into true performance numbers. We start talking about time to first byte, time to last byte. These are hard to measure. They're questionable relevance because they're one of those. Now you're talking about like lap times in a race car, which is great, but it won't necessarily win you a race. It sounds good, right? But it's often the number that's easiest to get at, and so we tend to look at that. And that really leads me to this slide, which I need to talk about the whole web page, because often we focus as developers on just the page, not the resources, right? And this little diagram here so it talks about that. When the browser fires up, goes and gets a page, makes a trip over the network, does that initial request. Now the web server's involved. It may do some stuff on the back end, grab some session, set some things up, grab data from the database, renders that response, fires it back to the browser. Now for the average developer, your job is done, right? I have rendered a page. Thanks for playing. See you later, right? But in reality, in this diagram, we're only halfway. And in reality, we're maybe 10% of the way, because now comes the actual rendering of the page. The web browser gets to work starting to parse that page, starts grabbing CSS files and JavaScript files. There's all these other trips back to the server as it actually gets to time to last byte. So that middle point was time to first byte, when the byte arrived at the browser. Time to last byte is at the end of that, which is actually the customer's experience. How long before I actually see the whole darn page? And so I'm just trying to paint a picture here of, let's think about the whole experience, because that really leads me to this equation. So I did not invent this equation. This equation was originally written by a wise man named Peter Sevik, but he was talking about WAN technology. So WAN, and don't worry, this slide deck's available, right? I've already put it up online. You can get it from ComNet, so feel free to write it down, but be aware you can download this. And I've embedded an Excel spreadsheet to help you use this equation. So Sevik was writing an equation around WAN links between remote sites and how you could actually figure out how much efficiency you were going to get from it. And I thought it was a really interesting way to break down the whole problem of web performance. So I've adapted it to that with his permission. And let me just run it down for you. So starting on the left is response time. That's usually the number we can get. Now, I've used the approximation symbol because this equation doesn't include everything. I'm not including DNS lookups. I'm not including TCP/IP negotiations. For me, for the moment, when I actually get down to the brass tacks with occasional exceptions, that doesn't add up to much. This equation really talks about the 4 core things that impact response time. So the first, which is the one that everyone thinks of right away, is this payload over bandwidth. The total number of bytes needed to transmit to make that web page, however big that is. And these days, the IDC says it's about 250K for the average external web page today, including all images and everything, divided by the bandwidth, right? And how much bandwidth do we need? More, especially in New Zealand, apparently. So often we stop there. That as long as I have enough bandwidth and the page size isn't too big and I've eliminated all my white space, I'll get good performance. But I hope this conveys to you there's a lot more to this equation. The next chunk here is what we call the latency chunk. So RTT is round trip time. How long there and back? Right? I don't care about how many bytes I move, just get me to the server and back again. Now, if that server's living in New Zealand, it's probably a ping time in the 20, 30 millisecond time range. I mean, actually, this is really tough to test because if you're testing in a lab with nice, fast 100 megabit connections, your ping time's under 10 milliseconds, which you'll never find out in the real world, right? That never happens. You actually get it out in the real world, and even if it's nice and local within the same city, it's going to be 3 times that. It's going to be 30, 40 milliseconds. As soon as we go any substantial distance, and I mean, on an island nation is particularly tough because as soon as you go any distance, you're crossing an undersea cable and being charged exorbitant rates for it. And so, ping times jump fast, right? I'm guessing, we could probably test this, ping time to the US from here, 150 to 200 millisecond range, right? I've worked on systems where we were in the Caribbean and we didn't even have fiber optic cable off those islands, right? And I did work in Jamaica before they pulled their first fiber optic cable, and so we switched to Hughes DSS, which is a satellite system, which sounds like a good idea, except the geostationary orbit is 23,600 miles straight up. And that's 300 milliseconds each way. So when you've got half a second of latency every time you make a request, don't make lots of requests. And that's what this piece of the equation really throws in. I've got one RTT, which is just, this is what it takes to get the page, right? Just the round trip time. And then I've got RTT times app turns, or all of the resources required. So again, IDC says today that average page that's 250K has about 60 resource files. So JavaScript files, CSS files, images, and so forth. So 60 round trips times that latency divided by the number of concurrent requests is the amount of time you're going to burn in latency. So how many concurrent requests do we get out of IE 7? 2. The HTTP 1.1 standard, a brilliant specification that has never been updated since 1998, it's sad that I know this, allows for exactly 2 connections, right? And so I can pull down 2 images at once, and you've seen this in the older version browsers, right? They without specification, upped it to 4 in IE8. I think the new version of Firefox ups it to 6, okay, which is actually out of spec. And you can, if you feel like it, go into the registry and tinker with IE to raise it to higher numbers, which is a really good way to make your browser not work correctly. It also looks like a DDoS attack to the web server, right? Because all of a sudden there's all these connections happening at once. There's a bunch of technologies being worked on right now to try and overcome this particular problem of this concurrency issue, because it's completely synchronous, right? In fact, it's so synchronous in earlier versions of browsers. If you think about IE 6 and below and Firefox 3 and below, if you requested a JavaScript file, that JavaScript file could have inline executing code. And the downloader and the parser are coupled together. So as that file would come down, it would stop the other pipe, because there may be code it needs to run, and it needs to compute that all in line. So every time you download a JavaScript file, everything else would stop while it parsed this JavaScript, right? And it was one of the punishments for Ajax in the early days. People noticed that 200K Ajax file you need to put right at the top meant that the page just halted while that came down, because it needed to compute all of that before it would render anything else. Now, IE8, Firefox 4 have all uncoupled the downloader from the parser, so that they continue to download as many ways as possible, and the parser still executes in line. Because you understand that the execution path that they're taking with JavaScript is correct. It's the right thing to do. It just hurts performance substantially, at least from the user's perspective. The visual part of that experience is that the page largely stops. So concurrency is a big deal, right? And our ability to download more resources can substantially speed this up. Now I'm going to actually work these numbers out in a sec. 2 more numbers to look at. Compute time on the server, compute time on the client, okay? And usually we tend to focus on compute time on the server, but compute time on the client is relevant. Often we can push stuff onto the client when you could talk about whether that's a good idea or not. Now how do we get these numbers? So I picked on the .NET Nuke homepage because Sean is a friend of mine, and I was actually relatively close to me. I was able to figure out 4.5 seconds pretty quickly. I used websiteoptimization.com, which is still out there, and you can type in a URL to that, and it'll actually spit out this breakdown. How much of the page is HTML, how much of it is images, how much is CSS, JavaScript, how many files are involved in each one. And so that gave me my payload number and my app turns number. I then went to speedtest.net, and you can use whatever speed test tool you like. I like that one because it's got pretty dials. You know? And you can see I had a good internet day that day. That's 7,000 kilobits coming down. Bits, not bytes, right? So the number always appears larger. And then about 1,000 kilobits up. So our bandwidth was heaps and piles. I figured out RTT using ping. Good old ping, right? This is an ICMP protocol, and I pinged the server, and I had 85 milliseconds, which is nice. Now, if you are a network guy, you will be cursing me right now, because ping is different than what your web browser actually does, right? Ping actually goes on the ICMP over ICMP protocol, not TCP. Now there is a tool called Ping TCP that you can download for free, and it will actually ping on port 80, exactly as if you were a browser. So, and you'll find in most cases these numbers are the same. But there are exceptions. I ran into a really evil one at a customer where the app worked beautifully inside the firewall, but at certain pages, as soon as we got outside the firewall, it didn't work properly. And it turned out it was a PIX firewall that was doing port 80 filtering. And so it wasn't, when we pinged it from externally, no problem. When we pinged TCP'd it, it was hugely slower. And it was because they were doing deep packet inspection on port 80. And this particular page was over a megabyte, which is a whole other issue. Can you say view state? Haha, I knew you could. And it was overflowing the buffer in the PIX, and so it would just reset the connection halfway through the page. Surprise! It took a while to diagnose that, but one of the things about ping is it actually ping TCPs. It'll actually go across the port 80, so it's pinging the same way, and if there is a difference, then you'll catch it there. But that gave me my round trip time. Now the last two numbers here, which arguably are the most important, but are also the hardest to figure out, is server code timing, client code timing. So that's code. I had to write that, right? So I put at the top of the page in ASP.NET, grab me a timestamp, and at the end of the page when it's finished, grab another timestamp. The difference is the server compute time. And same thing on the client. A little bit of JavaScript, some in the header that grabs the current time, and then at the on completion event that fires off the body tag, that's my finish of the page, and I'm able to figure out how much time there was there. And on a lot of pages that I've worked on, if you add debug equals true to the query string, I'll pop those two numbers up on the page. I've just started shipping with that because then when you're in the field and somebody's complaining their page is slow, right, and it looks fast to you, you just have to add that to the query string, it spits those numbers back, and you find out he's spending 60 seconds in client computing time because he has a 286. You know, or dumb things like that. So it's a great way to do quick diagnosis, just leaving something that will actually spit those numbers out for you. I've logged them. I've pushed them back in web service calls. There's lots of different ways to grab those numbers. So if we take all these numbers for this 4.5 seconds, this is that embedded spreadsheet. So this is in the slide deck. If you download it, you double-click on this, it'll pop up in Excel. So we had 4.5 seconds. Our payload was 280K divided by 717 kilobytes per second, right? I know it's 7,000 kilobits, but you got to divide it down. So total page time for, as far as bandwidth is concerned, was 0.3 seconds. 51 app turns at 85 milliseconds at 2 concurrent requests, 2.1 seconds of the total time. We had 0.8 on server compute, 1.2 on client compute. Now, let us suppose your boss is unhappy with the performance of this web page. 4.5 seconds isn't good enough. First thought is he needs a hobby. Suppose then, okay, you're going to try and reduce this time. As a developer, what will you do? You will open up the code to that page and you will stare at it until blood comes out of your forehead. That creates an inspiration to make the page faster in some way. Okay? And suppose you have the best weekend of your life and you knock it out. You double the performance of the page. So you've now taken that page from 0.8 seconds to 0.4 seconds, resulting in a 10% performance improvement on the page. And nobody's really thrilled with you, and you've lost a weekend, right? Where if you had these numbers, what would you focus on? How about combining all the JavaScript files into one? How about combining all the CSS files into one? Reducing the number of images, using browser cache properly, any number of these things to knock that number down. We could probably take a second off this with a little bit of thought and still have a weekend, right? Make sense? Okay. Step one, focus on the real problem. And that's what this really does, is break down where's the problem lie. Now that being said, let me now just undermine my whole argument. What parts of this equation scale? So as the number of users start to increase dramatically, where do we run out of things? So last time I looked, payload's going to be the same across all of the users, right? Same with round trip time, that's going to vary a little bit, concurrent requests. A lot of these numbers are static across as the number of users increase. In fact, we get more client compute time because we've got more clients, right? Payload, well, last time I looked at or bandwidth, last time I looked at the internet scales pretty well, as long as you have a good relationship with Southern Cross. You're going to be able to buy more. Bandwidth. In fact, the only number that ultimately won't scale is server compute time. That's the number that doesn't scale. But before you go jumping on that number, you should be able to see that. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, compute time on the server looks like this. And at 6 o'clock in the evening, it looks like this. So at our peak load time, it changes. That's when you know I'm now constrained by server, when those times vary. So before you do that, you start looking at that variation. Right? Once I can see that time is changing, now I know I can just start attacking compute time on the server. All right. So I've painted you a picture of how we tackle this problem. Okay, how we look at it. So now let's walk through the different kinds of apps, the iterations of applications. And somewhere I'm hoping your app falls in this spectrum. So if we're going to tell a story, let's think in terms of, well, I've spent most of my life at a consulting company, so a timesheet application, because, yeah, we need to write another timesheet application. So I'm working in a consulting company where everybody has to send in their timesheets at the end of each month. It's done in Excel because we have accountants, right? And everything is done in Excel for accountants. And everyone hates the timesheet. They all fill it in the very last day because they like to be paid, but they don't like the timesheet. And so as a developer who's inherently lazy, right, that's the nature of the species, I have built the great ASP.NET driven grid. All right, it basically recreated Excel as a grid, but it's got a bunch of smart lookups. It saves me time for finding projects and allocations. It does all the math for me. It's a better way to go. And so I'm the first person in the history company to file the timesheet on time and correct. And actually spits out the report, and my boss loves it. He's thrilled to death at this great timesheet app. And so he tells me, make sure the whole team uses this. Now, this is one of those viral projects, right? I did not submit a plan for this project. I did not really tell anyone. I didn't have any resources allocated to me. In fact, I threw the web page up on the build server because, well, it was sitting there and it had AIS running on it, so what the heck, right? I just put it there. Hey, it works. He never noticed the URL. We're running, right? It's all in. Okay, so now I've got the whole team running on that app as well. Got to get it working by the end of the month. So because nobody fills in their timesheets before the end of the month, right? They never do anything. So they wait till the very last day. The whole team tries to plug in their stuff all at the same time. This is where we run into stuff like, as the number of users rises above 1, stuff breaks, right? And so it turns out my beautiful spreadsheet that has everything on it, nobody else in the world can understand, right? And the boss wants the completed reports. He wants the combined data reports, all of these sorts of things. So this is just the stuff that happens in an app that's just been whipped together, right? A lot of this is not performance problems. This is just basically building an app in an intelligent way. And so we learn how to do multi-user access with this, and we sort of fix the app up to do the right thing. We watch people use it and go, oh, I never thought they'd do it like that. And we get the app working, get through that first rep, okay? Now, not every app starts like this. Sometimes we actually have a plan. And that's where we really get to this point where, say I have done this field app, we did get through that month successfully, and now there's a conversation about the whole group using it. So now we're going to jump up on the number of users. This would be a good time when we sort of take that step back and say, hey, do we really need to write another timesheet app? But we won't do that. That would be too easy. We've got an app already working. We're going to use that one. So now we start to expand the utilization of the app. So we add more users. They're spread out in more area. The next month end comes along. This is where we encounter, now we've got about 40 people using the app at the same time, all at the end of the month. That's when we also discover that there's some guys out that work remotely, and they want to access it through the VPN. But it's not available through the VPN, right? And so that guy calls my boss, says, hey, I can't use your app. It's not available through the VPN. And so my boss tells me, get it available through the VPN. So then I call IT and say, I want a hole punch through the firewall to the build server. And he says, you want what? Then he refuses. So I tell my boss he won't do it. He calls the director of IT. He calls that guy back, who now is not going to send me a Christmas card. And they punch a hole through the firewall, right? And those guys are now loading their data in, and everybody's entering stuff, and then a build happens. Because it was the build server, right? So now we get up to the question of, what's the limit of what one server can handle? And that's a question I get asked a lot. Because I can build sample apps that literally do 1,000 page. My benchmark server, the one we work on the most at Strangeloop, is a Dell 1950. They're 1U pizza boxes, right? 2-core, 4-core, 4 gigs or 8 gigs around there, and they're cheap machines. There's not a lot of fancy stuff in it. I think that model's actually been discontinued. But you can build a sample app that'll do 1,000 requests a second out of that box, right? Demo apps are amazing for that. But real apps fall over. The problem is you don't know what the fall over looks like. It's not always an obvious thing, right? Like if it did that, at least we know. right? Or a little sign pop out of the machine, help me, right? It doesn't look like that. We have to go to perfmon, typically. And watching the hard drive light blink, not a good way to measure performance on an app. I've done it, but it doesn't make it right. So, the number one thing that you will run out of in IIS running ASP.NET, the thing that is my best benchmark for you're in trouble is memory consumption. Right? It's generally not disk, it's generally not CPU. Memory consumption is the point where the machine is in trouble. It is not unusual to see processor hit 100% routinely on a busy web page. That's fine. If you're losing perfmon, there's 4 numbers I watch. Okay? One is the per processor, and I'm looking for it not to be pinned all the time at 100%. I'm looking for a sawtooth. Every so often there's a gap in utilization. That's enough for me to know the CPU is keeping up. The two other, then under the, so that's under the processor group. You know, everybody knows perfmon, right? It's like your own little internet inside the computer. Everything you need to know is in there. You just can't find it, right? So under ASP.NET, not ASP.NET applications, there's request queues. Okay? Now these are requests that are being sent to the web server but are not being served. They're being held in a queue. And there's only one reason for a request to be held in a queue. You're out of threads. Okay? Now there's a couple of reasons you could be out of threads. The most common one is you have a bunch of long-running queries going back to the database that are holding up those threads. And once it's out of threads, it'll hold the request there. Okay? The other reason is long-running garbage collection. So you run your machine out of memory and it has to run garbage collection, and it does a panic GC. While the GC is going on, it can't serve any requests. And so it holds those requests back. And typically, a normal GC is a fraction of a second. It'll never even register on perfmon. But request queues is a great way of looking at, every time, if you test a page yourself, and it always runs in 3 or 4 seconds, but people are saying it's taking 60 seconds for that page to come up, I'm betting 55 of those seconds is it sitting in a queue. So immediately I'll go watch request queues. I also watch requests per second, which is in ASP.NET applications. So that's specific to the app. Request queues is for the whole box, or at least for the whole workspace. And request per second is specific to the app. And that's just how many requests are we actually serving. So I've seen apps where there were no big request queues. Right? We weren't hugely buried in queues. We had a decent number of requests per second, but not huge. And the database was laying around. I mean, everything was working beautifully. Right? Nothing's panicking, but the site's really slow. And we spent weeks trying to diagnose this thing, trying to figure out why this app was so slow. And I finally, in frustration, went to the data center, which was in North Carolina. So it was not a trivial thing for me to go there. And I walked into the data center, and I'm looking at the rack, and I'm thinking there must be a hardware problem. And I find a 10 base T hub hanging off the back of the rack with the web server plugged into it. And I took the cable out, and I plugged it directly into the switch, and I get a phone call. Wow, you fixed it! You're a genius! I am going to kill somebody! It was, they were doing ethereal, which is now called Wireshark. They were doing pipe analysis, and if you use a switch, you can't see all the data. So this guy had a 10 base T hub so that he could actually see all the data, and he left it plugged in. Now, process memory, the fourth number I measure is .NET heap. How much memory is being consumed by the .NET heap? So the death spiral of IIS, when IIS is going to die, is when you get close to that maximum memory consumption. If you're getting close to around the 80% part is the part where garbage collection gets really important. It does a panic GC. Because in theory, there's no limit to how much memory you can allocate. It'll just keep allocating it. And in older versions of IIS, I could do this, where I'd allocate memory so fast, I just blue screen the machine. Which is a way of freeing up memory very quickly. But it's kind of hard on the app, right? So this death spiral is, you're getting close to the limit of memory consumption, right? Because .NET allocates out memory very fast, but it frees it up slowly. And as those panic GCs are running, and it's trying to shove that down, the request queues will build up while this GC is running, right? And then as soon as the GC is finished, it'll try and drain those queues. And it runs it out of memory again. It never empties the queue, right? Now another panic GC comes, so the queues build back up, memory goes back down, and you see the queues get bigger and bigger and bigger. And somewhere out here, I ask, okay, everybody, out of the pool. And it resets the worker process, which, again, frees up memory immediately. But it's hard on the app, right? Now all your sessions disappear because your worker process is recycled. And you know the worker process recycles anyway, right? What's the default? Anybody know? 25 hours. Every 25 hours, by default, in IIS, it recycles the worker process. 25 hours. It's So I was at TechEd US doing this session, and I said, what idiot thought 25 hours was a good idea? Which you should never do at TechEd US, because the idiot was at the back of the room. So he came up after the session. He said, you know what? When I originally did this in the beta, I made it 24 hours, and we had all of these tech support complaints for why does my app go nuts the same time every day? And it costs us a lot of money to figure out that it's a worker process record. So I made it 25 hours, so that when people complain it goes nuts a different hour each day, we know it's the worker process setting. I thought it was brilliant, actually. And you can set it to whatever you want, okay? So it's just a number. You adjust it by the second, right? You set it to what you want. It is wise to routinely restart the worker process. And it's even wiser for us to think through how do we build an app that will survive that. But I've seen applications where the machine's in so much distress, the worker process is recycling every hour, which makes it, then this means for the average user's experience, like think about this, what's it look like to the user, right? I'm putting stuff in my shopping cart, and then it goes away. I don't like you anymore. I'll go somewhere else, right? Or I put a few things, try again. If you take too long, you hit that threshold. Or think about this particular app, right? Guy's filling in his timesheet, and then it goes away. He doesn't like you. So, frequent worker process, and you can actually measure that in Perfmon too. How often are we recycling the worker process? Because it's a big deal. It's not something you should take lightly, and you need to watch out for. Main thing here is actually being productive. And often you get really lousy, people are complaining, my page is just blank, right? They don't actually see anything of how this thing is failing. These are often don't generate useful errors at all. So let's move along here. How do we fix this? Going back to our app, okay, maybe we should get off the build server. Good idea, right? So we get maybe a dedicated web server for this app now, because it's becoming important. And we'll share a database, which is fine. Now we start thinking through the sort of low-hanging fruit. This is the point early in the cycle of an app where staring at the screen seems to work, right? That I need to improve performance, so I look at the app and go, wow, select star from table, probably a bad idea. It was okay when we had 50 rows, but now that we have 10,000 rows, I might want to add some where clauses. Like there's those kinds of fixes, low-hanging fruit kind of fixes. And this is where you find out that sticking that whole grid into view state was probably a mistake. My current record for largest view state I've ever seen was 800K. So this was a guy who had, in his infinite wisdom, worked beautifully internally, right? Nothing like gigabit network connections to just hide the fact that you have these enormous pages. He had taken 15 controls in a grid with 50 rows. That will make a big page, I guarantee it. Right, so it's what do you stuff into? Now, use view state gently. Maybe turn it off. MVC just gets away from this whole issue. View state's not inherently evil. You just have to be careful with it. It was inherently evil in earlier versions when we couldn't control it, but the tool vendors have gotten better at dealing with it. Everybody's generally gotten more careful with it. So, if you build pages that way, don't feel bad. It works. You just have to be careful. So now we're switching over. One of the things that happens as an app gets more successful is that downtime becomes more and more costly. And so we've now got an app that's so successful, it's got dedicated hardware to it, it's a known app inside of the organization. You've switched over from viral to serious production app now. And so IT cares about it, right? Remember when you made that phone call? You ruined everything at that point, right? Because now they know you exist, so now they're taking care of the app. After that, nightmare, you'll have, and I've had lots of meetings like this, tons of meetings like this. After the crash, you have a meeting, right? Where the boss says, yeah, we can't have a crash like that anymore. And if you start asking these sort of core questions about how your app should operate, how reliable it needs to be, it's just like going to the grocery store hungry, right? You're going to make poor choices, right? So if you're having a discussion about reliability of your app the day after the crash, every time it's got to be 100% reliable. Now, as a consultant, that's good news to me because that means we're going to buy a lot of equipment. And so quickly I'll talk them out of it just by starting to draw out the infrastructure for 100% reliability. Well, we're going to need redundant internet connections. We're going to need at least 2 web servers. The database needs to be clustered. This is about $250,000 worth of gear. 100% reliability, no problem, right? And that's when they go, whoa, and you go, you know what I can do? We could go with, a 99% reliability scenario. Maybe some log shipping, only in a failure. You'll be down for a little while, but you'll recover and it'll be $20,000. Like, 99% good. So, but I also attack this from a different aspect, which is ordering the key elements of an application. So things, reliability is certainly one of them. Scale, performance is another one. But also accuracy. That's the one that everyone ignores, right? Accuracy. You say you have to pick one. One has to be number one. I mean, all of them are important, but one has to be number one. So I worked with a bank, right? This was an offshore banking institution in the Caribbean, and we talked about this particular problem. And I said, okay, look, what's worse? I have $1,000 here, I want to transfer it to here. So I remove it from this account and I insert it into this account, right? If everything goes well, that's the result. So what's worse? I take $1,000 out of here and we fail, and the $1,000 has disappeared, at least temporarily, as far as the customer is concerned. Or we leave it where it is, because, okay, the first one's worse. So you'd rather be down than wrong, right? I'd rather not do a transaction. I'd rather be down. Right? That's an important thought, that accuracy was number one. Now, that's not always the case. In most cases, accuracy is number one. But it's not always the case. I also did work with a company that that sold stuff on television. It was a very interesting business, because huge bullpen of people with headsets on. And we had a big screen at the end of the room that literally showed exactly when each commercial ran, because when one of those, buy now, get a free set of Ginsu knives, when you see those ads, typically they'll buy during the commercial break only. So the total cost of that ad has to be paid for in about a 4-minute window. And so they have tons of operators that are sitting there most of the time for that 4-minute window when they can take as many calls as possible. So they don't have time to look up people's addresses and things. It's all about just get the order in. And don't even worry about accuracy. The most important thing is get the person's contact information. Because they quickly learned in that business there was no problem that couldn't be solved by free shipping. Right? So they'd get the order wrong. They'd send the wrong stuff to this guy. He'd call back and go, this is not what I ordered. They'd say, keep it. We'll ship it to you correct. Right? It was more important to get the order right. So we were all about order entry speed. Everything was about order entry speed. We never validated any data. We never validated anything. As fast as you can enter orders, that's what mattered. Because the total limit of the profitability was that tiny little time window. So that was a different model, right? And you've got to figure out what the model is for your particular app. I'm betting accuracy is the one that will always come to the top. And it's interesting once you have that there, that you're prepared to sacrifice scalability, you're prepared to sacrifice performance for accuracy. I can make this go faster, but it might be wrong. Is that okay? For a banking institution, probably not. All right. So, we've now distributed this app to the whole company, right? We've got hundreds of people using this app. They're all on the last day. Because actually, we didn't need to be reliable for 3 weeks out of the month. We only need to be reliable one day. The last day of the month is the day that it runs. And at this point, we've probably got all those bugs knocked out. This app works. But as the number of users increases, the compute time on the server goes up as well. Right? So now performance is actually the issue. It's taking too long for people to enter their timesheets. There's some person somewhere on the lower floor there who spent the whole day trying to get it entered. And now, when you multiply that by the number of users, the number of hours that are going on, they start to add up the cost of using your app, right? This is where the ROI math comes into play. It's really evil, right? But it's also the side effect of if the app did crash, how many people were not productive that day? And it's a good way. I use this to my advantage. This is how I ended up being in this business this way. Is I would be sitting in the boardroom doing the math around how much will it cost us to have orders take 30 seconds versus a minute. And I could justify the budget of the hardware for that every time because we sold so much more where we could increase that performance. Same thing here. If I can make the app run faster, people enter the timesheets in less time, they get more time to do real work that generates revenue. And if you can work those numbers out, you're able to sit down with your boss and say, I can save this company $150,000 by spending $50,000. Right? I've got the numbers in place. It makes you very powerful once you can work those numbers out. Now, in order to get to that point, you're going to end up in a meeting. And the meeting's going to be made up of a group of dev folks and a group of infrastructure folks. And sometimes there'll be a projector there. And you may or may not have management show up briefly to tell you how you guys all have to get along, and then they'll leave. And this is where you're trying to figure out how to make this app go faster. And the IT folks are going to tell you that it's the code, and you're going to tell them it's the infrastructure. And that can turn into a fairly nasty game of finger pointing. Okay? Now, this is such a big topic that I've got a whole other session on this slide, essentially, that we can get into more detail on. We've only got so much time today. If this is interesting to you about how we work this out, we can do this this afternoon, back in this room. I think it's at the 2:55 slot. Okay? But the essence is this. Make the app the focus. Stop looking at each other, look at the screen. I've been brought in as a consultant on this job, and the best starting point I've ever had is the web config file. Because early on in the life of an app, the developer has set up the web config file, and ultimately the operations guys need to own it. And they usually, if they've never worked in ASP.NET before, have no idea what's in it. So working through it line by line till they can understand it, that's why I call it an IQ test. I'm going to teach you stuff. You need to teach me stuff, right? At the end of the day, we each need to know some stuff from the other person, right? And that process ultimately reveals things. So number one thing for dev to teach to IT, the web config file. Number one thing for IT to teach to dev, the network diagram. What is actually in our network? Because the average developer looks at the network this way. There is the user, there is the internet, there is a web server, and sometimes a database. And that's it, right? Now this is why IT guys are grumpy about this. You have reduced that man's job to the line between the internet and the web server. There's stuff in there that's important, right? But we don't know about it. And so when they actually can walk us through all those things, you reveal a bunch of important things. Like, hey, we have VPN, folks that connect through VPN. We have a failover site in a different location. Like all stuff that affects how the app works. If you knew about it, you would change the way you did things in your app. Right? I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because we are pressed for time, and if this is really interesting to you, there's a lot to talk about here. This afternoon we'll go into it further. Now, we get to the interesting part of the app. One web server's not cutting it anymore, and we've been told for years, all you have to do is add more servers, right? And it'll go faster. And I do talks on this particular one too, where I can show you over a course of an hour and a half how many times you can mess up going to more servers. Right? Where consistently, I added a new server and the site went slower than when I only had one server. Absolutely possible. It's even probable because it's not just about the hardware. The software has to be built to do it the right way. This is also where the staring at the screen till blood comes out of your forehead approach no longer works. You actually have to get methodical about performance tuning. Okay? So there are tools specifically for this. I like Ant's profiler. There is a profiler built into the studio. I don't think it's quite as clever. You know what I'm talking about? Method profiling. So this is basically a harness that we strap onto our app, and then we run a load on it, right? We have to write good test scripts for this. And it shows us, it'll bubble up the methods you're spending the most time in. And this is where we get into this sort of methodical approach, right? And what's the number one thing we can do to before performance this time? Caching, right? Right, this is where the caching hammer comes out. Just use it gently. Okay? The real problem now, as we get into this kind of tuning, is that the code you write that is more performant isn't obvious. It's weird. Okay? It's hard code to maintain. It's hard code to understand. Let me give you an example. If you've never played with the object caching library built into ASP.NET. So we've used amps. We've found the method that's bubbled to the top, right? It may be the fetching the customer list, right? Query takes 3 or 4 seconds to run. It's complicated. And everybody needs to run it all the time. So this query runs a lot, right? And maybe I've used SQL Profiler and shown this procedure is running over and over and over again. And it doesn't change that often, right? The data is fairly static. So great candidate for caching. So I find that that method that's bubbled up to the top is being run all the time, and I start adding caching code to it, right? So I add a reference to the caching object, and I add in a simple test. Okay, if the caching object is populated, then just hand a caching object back. If it's not, then run the query like you've always run it to populate the caching object. Now, if you write the code like that, as soon as you run a concurrency above 1, you'll have problems, because several people will try and run it at the same time, and they'll make a mess of the caching object, right? There'll be multiple writes on it at once. So you very quickly find out, I need to put a lock in. So if the caching object's not populated, block this method, right? Only one person can run this method. Now populate it and fall out the bottom. And that works. And you will notice a dramatic performance improvement. But if you're actually measuring closely, so I figured out that I needed to do this by looking at SQL Profiler, and I saw, look how many times this query is running. So now that I've written that code, and I've benchmarked it, and without a doubt it's faster, right? But I'm still running the query way too many times, right? It should only run once. Right? Caching objects, you can do a logical collapse of it. You can actually just set it to null to destroy it. Or you can do a time-based collapse. Say, hey, keep it around for 60 seconds and destroy it. But here I am. I know it just got created, and in that 60-second window, it run a bunch more times. How could that happen? The problem is in the code. So think about this. I've got a 4-second query. It's being requested once a second. Okay? First guy comes in. The object is null. Sets the lock. Starts populating it. Okay? The query is now running. Second goes by. Second guy comes in. It's still set to null. So he sets the lock. And waits. Third guy. Fourth guy. Now the first guy finishes. The object's now populated. He falls out. What happens to the second guy? He now repopulates the object again because he's passed the test. Right? He's already passed the if statement. So the correct pattern for caching is if the object is null, lock. If the object is null, which is a little counterintuitive. Now that works right. Now you'll see there's no more extra queries running. Genius, right? You feel brilliant. And in the next code review, some junior programmer going, why are you checking for null twice? I'll take one of them out. Right? So I've written a big comment block at the top of it that says, if this looks stupid to you, don't touch it. Ask Richard. And the reason I bring that up is that's what's happening to our code as we do this level of tuning. So first off, put that code in and test it. And if it isn't any faster, take it out. Because it's obscuring code, right? It makes stuff harder. And recognize also, you just made everything more expensive going forward. Anytime we deal with that customer object from now on, we have to make sure we reference the caching object properly. We have to make sure we destroy it at the right times. Like this is not free to do performance tuning, right? We're actually trading things off here that are not trivial. We're making it harder to build features in order to stay performant. So we're careful about it. We don't do it for fun. Right? And I've run into situations where people go nuts with the caching hammer, right? I know how to use this hammer and everything needs to be cached now, right? They do that, and you can actually run the machine out of memory doing that. So as of after ASP.NET 2.0, and one of the hot fixes, they actually marked cache memory as lower priority. So in a panicked GC, it'll actually throw all the cache away. And you can see this, right? And this didn't ship with ASP.NET 2.0. It was one of the hotfixes. But if you're running any of the later versions, you have this now. That cache memory is now lower priority. And so I've written pages deliberately to demonstrate this fact where we'll allocate memory like mad into cache objects, just piles and piles and piles of them until we run out of memory. And then the GC will come along and they're all gone. So we actually had an app where they'd gone mental with the cache hammer. And as it built up the cache, the app would clunk. Then it'd get for about 5-10 minutes, it would run brilliantly. Then it would run the machine out of memory, throw all the cache away, and it would clunk again. So they weren't all that happy with the app. And by reducing the number of things we cached, we actually got better results. Right? We actually instrumented the cache to show you how many times the cache objects being reused. Because we were finding they just weren't being reused that much. They were too unique. And so don't think that you can cache absolutely everything. You really have to be careful about how you do this. All right. We now get into version N. So I've gotten to the point now where I'm doing methodical performance tuning. Maybe I've even built a performance tuning team. There are some folks out there that think that's fun. Right? They're a strange group of people. I've also found it useful to rotate people through the performance team. So you work on features for a while, then come play with the performance team for a while, and then backing. It's just a different way of thinking. Like it makes the job more interesting. And different people react different ways to that. But this is now in version N because you go in this iterative process. So like everybody knows the largest ASP.NET app in the world was MySpace, right? They actually migrated from Cold Fusion to ASP.NET. And those guys think about performance tuning in ways you can't even imagine. But they all say one big thing, which is that performance tuning that app is like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. When you get finished, it's time to start again, right? And so it's just sort of an endless cycle of different ways to tune over and over and over again. But the bigger issue that you run into now is that reliability, keeping the app up, is more important. And ops is really nervous. They need to take care of that app. And they're going to put barriers in the way of shipping new features. And every so often people work around that by creating a tiger team, right? Which is really a way of saying, I don't want to do testing, right? I want to go around and just ship a feature. And my answer is always, you're going to test this. You're just going to test it on the customers, all right? So it's a question, did you want to test it on the customers? And so, the question that I pushed into the ops side is, what will make you comfortable? What do we have to do to demonstrate this feature is safe enough? And now we start getting into serious testing infrastructure, right? Typically, most development infrastructure is we've got dev machines, we've got QA machines, and then we push to production, right? When we get to this point, we have a pre-production environment. Because the dev machines and the QA machines tend to look like each other, and they don't look at all like production. I need a set of gear that looks like production gear. And that includes things like load balancers and their failover scenarios and all that sort of stuff that I can do the real testing on. I build up my test suites from the IIS logs. I take a look at how people are actually using the app, and those logs become my test scripts, right? I'll run them through tools like Web Trends to show profiles of this is how people maneuver through your site. They go to this page, and they go to this page, and this page 30% of the time. That's a test. And you gradually build up a suite of tests that look like how people use your app. So you can use that pre-production environment to look like what's going to actually happen. This is epic scale. Any site pushing over 500 requests per second is a big site. If you're playing in this league, you're playing in a rarefied league. Typically with a Dell 1950, right? Like I said, I can build a demo machine that'll do 1,000 requests per second, no question, okay? Real life apps rarely get above 100 requests per second, ever. 25, you're kicking ass taking names, right? At that point, most of the time you'll go to multiple servers by that point. And not for performance, you'll go for reliability. That's the number one reason that people go to multiple servers, is they want the reliability. Can't afford to be down. Or they want to be able to seamlessly roll updates out to the app without taking it down. So at least 2 servers, I can take one out of the farm, update it with the new version, flop everybody over to it, update the other one, and then off we go again, right? And so the user actually on the site suddenly gets a new version of the page, but the shopping cart survives, and they just continue on. Right? Seamless updates. I did a lot of work with this back in the late 90s in Barnes & Noble. And at that time, we had 100-plus web servers running. And we would use Cisco load balancers, and we'd take blocks of machines out and update them to the new version. And then we'd get to a point where we'd flop and move over to the other one. And you had a lot of code checking what version of the shopping cart you have. Do you have the last rev or the current rev? And once you got to the new rev, you had to stay on the new machines and so forth. But seamless updating became very sexy. It was what people really wanted. At this point, if you still had your session in process, you're in big trouble, okay? Because here's the evil thing about session. Everything else that's being allocated in the .NET heap is mutable, right? Typically, you allocate a bunch of variables at the top of the page, and by the time the page finishes rendering, that's all marked as deleted. So it can be tossed out, no problem at all. Even cache objects. There's not as many of them. They're bigger. They persist for longer, but they're low priority. In a panic, they can still be thrown away. But session in process is not. It has to be rewritten, right? So as that cycle runs to try and free up memory, it's moving those session objects around, rewriting chunks of memory. And if your session object's big, that's a big deal. You have a static chunk of memory that cannot be removed, and it persists for a long time, and it slows down garbage collection. So out in these outer reaches, this will absolutely crucify you. And the solution is you've got to go out of process. Now there's choices for out of process. There's the free ones are state server, which is worth every penny you paid for it, or SQL Server, which is really a bad use of SQL Server, because SQL Server is a little bit smarter than, here, hold this. Okay, now give it back to me. Oh, now hold it again. Oh, no, give it back to me. Like, it's a better product than that, right? So, but we use it because we typically have one in place. We already own the licenses for it. That's where we tend to go. There are third-party products that also provide session providers. So there are choices there to find better external session providers. As soon as you go to multiple servers, if you're heavy on caching, you've got cache coherency problems, right? So you've expired the cache on that machine, but not on that one. So now how do I synchronize those caches? Do I write my own expiry mechanism? There are now, Microsoft's got a velocity that's supposed to help with that. It's a very challenging problem because it's this N+1 problem. As the number of machines increases, that stuff falls over. The magic number typically for mass notification like that is 7 servers. At 7 servers, you're spending so much time expiring stuff, you're burying a network. It's a weird problem. And I've used third-party products, and we keep seeing it running that number. It works great at 5. And as soon as you get to 6 or 7, it breaks up. And so then we start making clusters of 5 servers that are separated from each other by affinity. It's complicated, but it is a hard problem. I've talked a fair bit about I've sort of referenced load balancing a few times. If you've never played with this, anybody got a load balancer? Who lives with a load balancer? A couple of hands here and there. Do you know what model load balancer you own? But it's not unusual for us not to know. Oh, so one guy knows. What is it? An F5, the big gun. Right? So there's sort of 2 tiers, maybe 3 tiers of them. The big guns are F5, Cisco, and Citrix, right? NetScaler. In the $80,000, $100,000 class, buy 2 for reliability. Very powerful, performant devices, no choice about it. And then below that, you've got the Barracudas and the Coyote Points, and they're in the $10,000, $20,000 class. it is useful as part of that meeting between IT and dev to talk about the load balancer, because affinity, failure paths, all those things vary from device to device. So here's a really evil trap. You've got a blog. Let's say you're taking comments on your news, okay? You want to filter comment span. So one of the best ways you filter for comment span is say how many comments is a given IP allowed to make, right? You say it's like 1 per minute, because a comment span will crank out a whole bunch of them. Well, if you're using a load balancer, the IP address is now always the load balancer. But the load balancer itself will give you a different token in the HTTP header for what the external IP address is. But depending on the load balancer you're using, it's a different token. You need to know, or you'll never make that work. So the same thing. We've been told, I just upgraded to 2 servers, I add a load balancer, it just works, comments die. Right? It's just one of those goofy things. You need to know about that stuff. You're going to get into a scenario now where you can't reproduce problems in production, right? And you have to start instrumenting your production app. Your pre-prod app, your load test just won't be the same. So little tricks to be able to instrument your production environment become vital. You can't run profilers on that. So test points, logging, ways to actually see under load what's going on. Instrumenting your cache, just keeping a log of how often cache objects got reused. It's probably the best way to find out you're wasting memory on cache. Okay, I think I've hit the limit of my time. This is a huge topic. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I will be around the rest of the day. I'll try and hang out in the recharge bar about it and happily ask more. And this afternoon, we'll do the IQ test. All right? Thanks very much, and have a good rest of the conference.